Immigrant Families Together is one of the most comprehensive foundations in existence assisting immigrants in need. The organization has raised almost $3 million in support for bonds, healthcare, and living essentials in order to ensure families can stay together and start a stable life in America without becoming a public charge. Founder and director, Julie Schwietert Collazo, started it all in 2018, and she joins me here today. Welcome, Julie, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
You started Immigrant Families Together in 2018. Tell me how you began this whole journey.
In the summer of 2018, as I was listening, as many people were, to the news about what was happening on the border with respect to separations of families, I became increasingly desperate to do something actually useful. And one day I heard a local attorney on our local NPR affiliate talking about his client who was in immigration detention in Arizona. And he said, look, she has 3 kids. They're in foster care in New York. She's in Arizona. She could be reunited with them if she had a way to pay her bond and she had a way to get from Arizona to New York. And I thought, well, that sounds really concrete and achievable. I had no idea what the bond was, but I felt that it would be possible to raise bond money and find a way to bring that mom from Arizona to New York. And that's how this started, really. The following Monday, I cold called the attorney. I found him pretty easily on Google. He answered on the first ring. I explained that I had heard him on the radio, and I said, look, I think that among my friends, we could raise the money for her bond and find a way to get her to New York and back to her kids. And I said, would that be of interest to you and to her? And he just started laughing. And he said, of course it would be of interest, right, because she has no way to pay this money. Right. And so I said, well, do we have your permission then to start a GoFundMe campaign? And he said, yes. And we started it on Monday, I believe it was June 25th, 2018. We found out the next day that her bond had been set at $7,500. By the time we found that out, we had already raised more than that. You can pay the bond anywhere in the United States. And so almost all of our bonds have been paid here at the office in New York. We didn't want to expose her to more law enforcement figures or people in authority who could frighten her, who may not speak Spanish, on her journey from Arizona to New York. And so what we did is we set up a cross-country network of volunteer drivers. People knew that we were fundraising for her, that we had been able to get her bond. Volunteers just appeared who were sort of first or second degree friends or acquaintances who said, look, I know somebody in Phoenix who could go pick her up, and I know somebody who can drive her from Phoenix to, Albuquerque, for example.
Right.
And we had an amazing volunteer, Megan Finn, who coordinated the transportation all the way across the country and just really quickly created this system of communication and monitoring to make sure that she was safe every step of the way, that she had homes to sleep in, people to feed her along the way. What Jenny remembers from that experience, it was sort of this healing moment in a way, or a journey toward healing, where, she had come here and she had been sort of met with all of these toxic aspects of America, right? And then all of a sudden, here are all of these people who are total strangers who are driving her for hours, welcoming her into their homes. She has said that it was important to help her understand that there were good people here who cared and wanted to help. And by the time she got to New York, this had attracted so much media attention that Cory Booker had come out to greet her and help her move her luggage for the last transfer in Newark. We had state and nationally elected officials who met her in New York to welcome her. It grew very, very quickly, and the donations continue to come in.
How's she doing right now?
She had her final hearing for the immigration court in North Carolina in September of 2019. She was denied asylum, so her case right now is in appeal.
Did you always work with immigrants, or is this new to you?
I'll just mention that my husband, who's the co-founder of Immigrant Families Together, is a refugee from Cuba who came here in 1980. So that's definitely always been a part of my adult life. Because I'm bilingual, I typically carried the Spanish-speaking caseload at the agencies where I worked.
What are you doing besides offering bond to immigrants?
Really early on, it was clear to us that we really had to provide comprehensive, continuous support as the family pursued their asylum claim. One of the reasons is because it takes so long for people to be able to get work authorization that how do you expect them to be able to take care of themselves and their family and not become a public charge while they're waiting for their asylum proceedings? So housing in many cases, if somebody didn't have family here who was going to be taking them in, legal counsel, medical, mental, and dental health, and transportation to and from essential appointments, and food, as well as then some logistical and getting kids enrolled in school. And so we assess each family's needs and then work with them to get those different categories of need met. Other barriers that I think are particularly relevant to these families is that it's difficult for them. They've just landed in a city where they don't know the transportation system, if there is one. In many cases, they're in places where they don't have access to public transportation. They don't know how to use it. They don't have money to access it. So they can't get to 3, 4, 5 different agencies to access different kinds of support. There's also the issue of childcare. If you need to go to 5 different appointments, you don't have somebody to watch your child. Right. So there were all these barriers to accessing all this support, even in cities like New York, where we have a really rich, varied social support system, right? But if you can't access it, then it means nothing to you.
How has the Remain in Mexico program affected the assistance you're providing? Because now people are no longer in detention in America to get a bond. They are on the opposite side of a bridge in another country, not allowed into America.
Yeah, it's definitely affected our work. I mean, we've paid and advocated on several cases of folks who have been in the Remain in Mexico program to let them know that we're available to assist in those cases. We have provided material and financial support to both our own volunteers who live and work in the borderlands, as well as a few other organizations like Team Brownsville that provide food, that provide educational support, hygiene support, for example. So we have sent books and toiletries. For 3 months, we paid the school lunches for everybody at the sidewalk school in Matamoros. So we're trying to sort of insert ourselves in other parts of the process much earlier so that we can also help partner organizations who are doing the on-the-ground work on the front lines.
So many people in detention, so many worthy people, and you can't bond everybody out. Mm-hmm. How do you choose?
So initially, because we were founded in response to the zero tolerance policy, our initial criterion was really just a single criterion, and that was whether somebody was a parent or a guardian who had been separated from a child. Since then, we've looked at and have provided support for 2 other primary categories of folks, which are LGBTQ and people with medical conditions that make them particularly susceptible to either permanent loss of some sort of functioning or potentially death by prolonged detention. And this has become particularly relevant, obviously, during coronavirus, because we've been providing a lot of logistical support to attorneys, for example, who are filing for humanitarian parole for folks who are at particular risk of becoming infected.
Poor person who comes and leaves with nothing from Guatemala or Honduras, they come here. If they have $10 in their pocket, they're lucky. What are the bonds that you first started seeing, and have they been increasing?
I wouldn't say they've been increasing, but I would say that they are not set with attention to somebody's ability to pay. I would say we have seen wild inconsistencies, and that we know that bonds are set based on whether somebody's determined to be a flight risk, these other variables, whether somebody's entered in before, whether they have a criminal history. But there really doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason when we look across the board at the 120 bonds that we've paid, and we look at their flight risk, which is just an absurd criterion in and of itself, right? Somebody comes here fleeing, they're not going to flee somewhere else. Our lowest ones have been $1,500, and the highest one we've paid is $40,000.
40,000, right? It's crazy, right? Crazy. For somebody basically in a similar situation. They came from a Central American country. They came and applied for asylum. They don't have a criminal record.
Right.
And they have what would presumably be a legitimate claim for asylum. So why would one be 1,500, one would be 40,000? Who knows? And bonds are to make sure you show up to court, as we were discussing. Has everybody showed up to court? Have you breached any bonds?
We've breached some bonds, yes. We're actually in the process right now of reviewing all 120 to see where they are in their process. We've had maybe 3 breaches. The breaches that happen are not always sort of willful. They are really confused. It's an incredibly opaque, confusing system, even for somebody who is well educated and is a citizen here and speaks English.
You're telling me I've been doing this for 35 years. So you've also raised to another $2 million to transport people across the United States to provide them assistance. Have you had difficulty to rally people to raise so much money?
A nonprofit often finds itself in the constant work of pursuing grants, right, and filing grant applications, and we certainly do that as well. But we've had a number of foundations come to us and say, we want to give you a no strings attached grant for you to use as you will. But I have to say that the majority of that money has come almost exclusively through small donors, right? And so it's really about the power of the collective. Some of my favorite stories are from a woman who sent $3 and said that it was the last money from her Social Security check and that she wished she could send more.
Wow.
And you see things like that, or you see kids selling their favorite books. It's incredibly moving and really shows that there are very, very many people who want to do something. They just want to be guided in terms of figuring out what it is that they can do that will be impactful.
Do families keep in touch with you after, they got a place to live and a job?
We do. Yeah, we absolutely do. So we're in direct contact with most of the families, and from many of them, we hear from them even on a daily basis. We have 5 or 6 families here in New York where I live, and so we see them fairly regularly.
You've worked so closely with lots of people. What kind of trauma are they facing there?
There are certainly at least 2 categories of trauma, and one is the trauma that they experienced in their country of origin, which often will have to do with gangs or violence that's been perpetrated against them or by someone in their family. And then there's the trauma, I think, of the journey itself in many cases. We have some people, for example, who have walked through the Darien Gap to get here, which is just a terrifying journey. People who've ridden La Bestia, the train, to get here, who have seen, people fall off the train and lose limbs or even die. And, folks who've crossed deserts and been in trucks. And so I think the experience of getting here, certainly the family separation policy was extraordinarily traumatic for parents and guardians and the kids who were separated from them. More recently, for example, we've been working on a lot of cases of Cubans who've arrived here and, they've been detained for a year or longer. They just never expected they would even be detained. And so I think there's the trauma of thinking that you're going to this place that's really been sold to you as the land of the free and the home of the brave, and yet you're sitting for a year in an immigration prison and you haven't even committed any criminal wrongdoing.
Tell me some of the success stories.
So we have several people who've been granted asylum already.
Right.
A lot of the asylum cases, the final hearings are not even scheduled until 2022 or 2023. So some folks are waiting a really long time. But we've had a few folks be granted asylum already. I think one of the biggest success stories is the 6th mom for whom we paid bond actually just has a book that came out in English and Spanish, published by Harper, about her journey and about the experience of separation and what prompted her to come here. And in full transparency, I co-wrote the book with her, but it really humanizes the experience of the migrant journey. And it's really her hope that the book will help shift the national conversation about the reasons why people come here and what they want to contribute here as well. She's also a success story because she is the co-president of her son's PTA here.
She's really, I don't know, was it like a year or two, really done a lot, enormous, but then people who are actually even born here. Right. How many people born here wrote a book and is the president of the PTA?
Right. She has also begun to look at ways of how she can sort of leverage the resources that she has developed here to provide some greater stability in her home community so that people don't have to feel like leaving is their only option. And so I use her as an example a lot because it really points out to, every family that we're working with, not a single one of them wants to be a drain on American resources. They want to contribute. They're amazing neighbors. These are the kind of people that you want to be your neighbor. You want them to be a part of your community. They have so much to contribute.
Now, how can people help Immigrant Families Together?
Well, donations obviously are always the best way to help. So I was very resistant to becoming a nonprofit. But when we got to the point that we were raising so much money that we needed better mechanisms for accountability and transparency, that was really the only option that we felt was available to us. And so I think what people don't know about nonprofits is that it takes a lot of money to run them. None of us are salaried. I don't have a salary. My husband doesn't have a salary. None of our other folks are salaried. But it takes a lot of money to get your financials audited every year. Right. It takes a lot of money to have the taxes for a nonprofit done. And so there's a lot of money that's tied up in administration. And the fact that we really do provide this ongoing comprehensive support to families. We are the guarantors on probably a dozen apartments for families. And so there's sort of this open-ended long-term commitment to house them until they're able to be self-supporting. And as I was mentioning, because the work authorization permits take so long and the Trump administration has just been so relentlessly terrible, the ability for somebody to really establish themselves and become self-supporting is a much longer process than was the case in the past.
Yes. Do you find that people are anxious to get their work permits and work?
Extremely anxious. That's one of the first questions that they ask us is how can they get their work permit? When somebody has a work permit, that doesn't mean that they have a job that pays them a living wage. And you ask, how can folks help? Is really to look at some of the bigger picture structural issues related to immigration and immigration policy in this country and advocate for things like a living wage, which affect immigrants enormously. Key thing to remember too is that all of these issues are tied together, right? So protesting right now in response to police brutality and deaths of Black men and Black women specifically are very much adjacent to and related to immigrant communities. I think also really looking at what are your local elected officials doing to be a welcoming community? Do you live in a sanctuary city? Does your local government have supports in place for asylum seekers? I think, I personally was not particularly involved in local politics until IFT. I was much more interested in national politics. And what I've really come to understand through my work with this organization is how much political change can be led on the local level. And so I would really encourage people to get involved with their local politics and also with things like local PTA and local school board. Working on curricular reform, for example, and educational reform are also really important issues. They're all related to the immigrant, movement. Our website is immigrantfamiliestogether.com, and we are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well.
What's your American dream?
What I would really love to see is a move away from these sort of puritanical values of like each person for themselves and sort of, like we're all starting from a level playing field. We're not starting from a level playing field. And really understand that some of the things that we're seeing now, like mutual aid and mutual care, to really understand that we're responsible for each other, right? And to look at that and not wait for leaders to rescue us or to right things, right? The greatest lesson of IFT for me has been that a group of people who don't necessarily have any particular special skills, who don't individually have great wealth, but collectively can collaborate to make things better for people. That's my American dream, is that we each sort of understand our role. Not that this is something to be realized and implemented by somebody else or a politician, but it's really something for each of us to work on daily in our own communities in our own way.
Well, it's a great organization, and what an amazing success, and helps so many families. You bonded out over 120 people. Congratulations to you, Julie Schwietert Collazo. Appreciate your time on our show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.